Welcome, dear viewers, to a journey through the annals of history, a story of power, innovation, and empire. Today, we step into the ancient world to witness the rise of a civilization, often overshadowed by its neighbors, yet unmatched in its mastery of iron, the Hittites. Emerging in the rugged lands of Anatolia over San Wubact years ago, the Hittites were more than warriors. They were architects of diplomacy, engineers of war, and keepers of secrets that would shape the fate of kingdoms. Their chariots thundered across battlefields. Their treaties laid the foundations of international law, and their smiths forged weapons that would tilt the balance of power. This is not merely a tale of kings and conquests. It is the chronicle of a people who thrived in the shadows of giants, and yet carved their name in the stone of time. As we explore their cities, meet their rulers, and uncover their mysteries, prepare to see history through the eyes of those who wielded the very metal that defined an age. The Hittites are calling from the dust of the past, and their story is ready to be told. The winds of Anatolia sweep across rocky plateaus and green valleys, whispering of a time before empires. In this rugged land, small tribal communities tilled the soil, hunted game, and forged fragile alliances. Among them, a culture began to rise, one that would one day challenge Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. They called themselves the Hatti, after the ancient people of the land, but in time they would become known as the Hittites. In their early days, the Hittites were not yet an empire. They were farmers and herders, living in hilltop settlements built from mud brick and timber. Yet even now, the seeds of greatness lay hidden in their earth, veins of ore that their smiths began to work into copper and bronze. Around their hearths, elders spoke of kings chosen not by divine birth, but by the will of the gods through strength and wisdom. The rugged terrain taught them resilience. The unpredictable climate made them resourceful. Trade with Mesopotamian cities introduced them to writing and new technologies, while constant skirmishes with neighbors hardened them into fierce warriors. Slowly, a vision formed not of survival alone, but of dominance. This was the dawn of a people who would master not only bronze, but iron itself, and in doing so, reshape the destiny of nestled high in the Anatolian mountains, lay a site destined to become the beating heart of a future empire, Hattusa. Its location was both a blessing and a challenge. Steep hills and narrow passes made it nearly impregnable, yet the harsh winters demanded ingenuity to survive. Around Ichenlobite Wuses BCE, a leader named Hattusili I rose to power, determined to transform this settlement into the seat of his kingdom. Massive walls began to snake around the hills, built of stone foundations topped with mud brick battlements. Gates flanked by carved lions and sphinxes announced that this was no mere village. This was the capital of the Hittites. Inside, the great temple took shape, a sprawling complex dedicated to the storm god Teshub and the sun goddess of Arina, the divine patrons of the people. Life inside Hattusa was vibrant. Merchants brought goods from far-off lands, tin from the east, textiles from Babylon, and precious lapis lazuli. Scribes recorded royal decrees in cuneiform on clay tablets, preserving laws, treaties, and myths. Soldiers trained in the courtyards, their chariots clattering over cobblestones. Hattusili knew that power was built on more than stone walls. It required loyalty and order. Through diplomacy and calculated warfare, he extended Hittite influence, binding vassal states to his rule. Hattusa was no longer just a settlement. It was a symbol. The rising star of Anatolia, religion was the lifeblood of the Hittite world, and no god held more sway than Teshub, the storm god. To the Hittites, storms were not merely weather, they were divine commands. Thunder was the roar of Teshub's chariot wheels, and lightning his spear. Victory in battle was proof of his favor, while defeat signaled his wrath. In the great temple of Hattusa, priests performed daily rituals, pouring libations of wine, burning incense, and offering bread and lamb to the gods. Festivals brought processions through the streets, dancers in colorful robes, musicians playing lyres and drums, and chariots bearing sacred statues of the gods. Kings were seen as chosen by the gods to rule. Hattusili often led ceremonies himself, wearing the horned crown of Teshub. His authority rested on both military might and spiritual legitimacy. Omens were read from the entrails of sacrificed animals, and the movements of stars were tracked to guide royal decisions. The people believed that as long as they honored the gods, their fields would yield grain. Their enemies would fall, and their cities would thrive. The storm god's favor was not just a blessing, it was the very foundation of the Hittite Empire, the Hittites' greatest secret. The one that would set them apart from every rival was their mastery of iron. While others still fought with bronze, Hittite smiths learned to extract iron from the earth and hammer it into weapons of unmatched strength. In smoky workshops, bellows roared as charcoal-fed furnaces reached blistering temperatures. Smiths worked tirelessly, their hammers ringing against anvils, sparks dancing in the air. Iron ore was smelted, purified, and forged into swords, spearheads, and arrow tips. This technology was guarded as a state secret. The knowledge of ironworking was passed only to the most trusted artisans. An iron sword could cut through bronze shields, and an iron spear could pierce armor with ease. This gave Hittite armies a decisive edge on the battlefield. Commanders boasted that their weapons were blessed by the gods, forged with divine fire. Iron was not only for war, it became a symbol of royal power. The king's throne was adorned with iron fittings, and iron rings were given as diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers. In the hands of the Hittites, iron was more than metal. It was the foundation of an empire. The chariot was the pride of the Hittite military, a machine of speed, strength, and terror. Unlike the lighter chariots of Egypt, the Hittite design was heavier, built to carry 3 warriors, a driver, a shield-bearer, and an archer. This allowed for greater endurance and devastating force in close combat. Chariots were crafted from seasoned wood, reinforced with bronze, and mounted on spoked wheels for agility. Horses were trained from youth to endure the din of battle, to charge in perfect formation, and to hold steady under the clash of swords. On the training fields outside Hattusa, lines of chariots thundered forward, the ground trembling beneath them. Archers loosed volleys of arrows as drivers swerved around targets, while shield-bearers deflected incoming missiles. The king himself often inspected these exercises, for the chariot corps was the backbone of Hittite power. In war, chariots were used to break enemy lines, scatter infantry, and chase down fleeing troops. At the height of the Hittite Empire, they were feared across the ancient world and respected even by the Egyptians, who faced them in the great clash at Kadesh. The chariot was more than a weapon. It was the rolling symbol of Hittite dominance. A great empire is held together not by walls alone, but by laws. For the Hittites, their legal code was a cornerstone of governance, a system that balanced justice with practicality. Unlike the harsh, uncompromising decrees of Hammurabi, the Hittite laws were notable for their moderation. Crimes were punished, yes, but often with fines rather than execution. If a man injured another in a fight, he might pay compensation in silver or goods instead of losing his life. This reflected the Hittite belief in restitution over retribution. The goal was to restore balance, not to indulge vengeance. The laws covered everything: property disputes, theft, slavery, marriage, inheritance, and even the protection of animals. Royal scribes recorded them on clay tablets, each decree sealed with the king's authority. These tablets were stored in the archives of Hattusa, accessible to officials and judges. By making the law accessible, the Hittite kings strengthened loyalty among their subjects. Farmers knew their rights in disputes over land. Merchants trusted the courts in cases of fraud. Even slaves could appeal for justice under certain conditions. The legal code was a living testament to the Hittite vision of order, one in which power was tempered by fairness, and justice served as a pillar of the empire's endurance. In the Hittite world, diplomacy was as vital as the sword. The kings maintained an intricate web of alliances, treaties, and trade agreements, often sealed with elaborate ceremonies. Envoys traveled great distances, carrying messages on clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform, written in the international diplomatic language of Akkadian. These emissaries were more than messengers. They were the voices of the king himself. Trained in rhetoric, skilled in negotiation, and fluent in multiple tongues, they navigated the delicate politics of the ancient Near East. The Near East, a misplaced word, could start a war. A carefully crafted phrase could avert one. Royal treaties often invoked the gods as witnesses, with elaborate oaths sworn before idols. Gifts were exchanged: fine horses, iron weapons, gold vessels, and exotic goods from far-off lands. Envoys returned with intelligence about foreign courts, enemy troop movements, and economic opportunities. This diplomacy extended to marriage alliances. Hittite princesses were wed to foreign kings, and foreign princesses came to Hattusa to join the royal household, forging bonds that politics alone could not. Through such skilled diplomacy, the Hittites expanded their influence far beyond their borders, proving that the pen, or rather, the stylus, could be as mighty as the sword. While the Hittites excelled in open-field battles with chariots, they were equally adept at siege warfare. Their enemies often took refuge in fortified cities, hoping to outlast their attackers, but the Hittites had methods to break even the strongest defenses. Siege engineers designed massive wooden towers, pushed close to enemy walls to allow archers to fire from above. Battering rams, sheathed in wet hides to resist fire, smashed through gates. Sappers tunneled beneath walls, collapsing their foundations. In preparation, Hittite armies surrounded a city, cutting off all supplies. Weeks or even months of pressure could starve defenders into surrender. Sometimes psychological warfare was used. Captives displayed, fires lit at night to show the army's size, drums beaten in unison to unnerve the enemy. One of the most famous Hittite sieges was against the city of Carchemish, a strategic stronghold on the Euphrates. After months of relentless pressure, the gates finally fell, and the city became a vital part of the empire's eastern frontier. Siegecraft was an art to the Hittites, a combination of engineering skill, patience, and ruthless determination. Their mastery ensured that no fortress was truly safe. From the iron hand of Hattusa, trade was the lifeblood of the Hittite economy. Stretching from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, their trade routes carried goods, culture, and ideas across vast distances. Hittite merchants dealt in tin and copper for bronze making, woolen textiles, fine pottery, and later, coveted iron goods. Caravans of donkeys and ox-drawn carts wound through mountain passes and across arid plains, laden with goods. Merchant caravans traveled under military protection, for bandits and rival states threatened these valuable lifelines. The Hittites also controlled key ports on the Mediterranean coast, enabling them to engage in maritime trade. From these harbors, ships carried timber, wine, and silver in exchange for ivory, spices, and precious stones. Trade was not only about material wealth, it also brought knowledge. The Hittites learned new agricultural techniques, artistic styles, and even religious concepts from the lands they traded with. In return, they spread their own innovations, such as legal ideas and diplomatic practices. Through commerce, the Hittites wove themselves into the fabric of the ancient world, ensuring that even distant kingdoms knew of the iron-wielding power in Anatolia. Even a mighty king needs wise counsel. In Hattusa, the king's authority was supported by the Panku, a council of nobles, generals, and high priests. This body advised on matters of war, diplomacy, law, and religion, ensuring that the ruler's decisions reflected the interests of the realm. Council meetings took place in the Royal Audience Hall, a grand chamber with stone pillars and richly painted walls. Here, the king sat on a high-backed throne while council members stood or knelt before him. Discussions could be intense. Generals might urge for war, while diplomats counseled peace. Priests interpreted omens, scribes presented reports, and envoys relayed news from distant provinces. Ultimately, the king had the final say, but ignoring the council could risk unrest among the nobility. This system allowed for a balance of power, preventing rash decisions and ensuring the stability of the realm. It was a testament to the Hittites' pragmatic governance that even in a monarchy, the voices of others carried weight. Through the Panku, the Hittite kings maintained unity, forging policies that kept their empires strong amid the shifting tides of ancient politics. The reign of Mersili I marked one of the most daring military campaigns in ancient history. Rising to the throne after the death of his predecessor and kinsman, Hattusili I, young Mersili inherited not only the crown, but also his uncle's ambition. The Hittite heartland was secure, but the king's gaze turned south, toward the wealthy lands of Mesopotamia. In a move that shocked the ancient world, Mersili led his armies across hundreds of miles through hostile territories to the gates of Babylon itself. The city, a jewel of the Near East, had grown complacent behind its towering walls. The Hittites struck swiftly, breaching Babylon's defenses and plundering its treasures. This lightning raid brought immense wealth to Hattusa and struck fear into neighboring kingdoms, but victory came at a cost. The long journey back left the army exhausted, and unrest festered at home. Mersili's boldness had overextended the empire, and whispers of betrayal grew louder within his own court. Eventually, the warrior king fell not on the battlefield but to palace intrigue, assassinated by those who coveted his throne. Yet his campaign against Babylon became legend, proof that the Hittites were not merely regional powers, but players on the grand stage of history. After Mersili I's assassination, the Hittite court was plunged into chaos. The palace, once a place of order and ceremony, became a nest of conspiracies. Royal kin plotted against each other, ministers whispered in dark corners, and the throne seemed more a curse than a prize. This period of unrest, often called the Years of Turmoil, saw rapid changes in leadership. Kings rose and fell in quick succession, their reigns cut short by daggers in the dark or poison in the cup. It was a dangerous game where alliances shifted overnight and loyalty was a rare commodity. Despite the bloodshed, the machinery of the state endured. The army still defended the borders, scribes still recorded decrees, and the gods were still honored in the temples. But the stability of the empire trembled, and its enemies watched closely for weakness. Amid this storm, some royal figures fought not only for power but for survival. Every banquet could be a trap. Every ally could turn traitor. The fate of the Hittite Empire hung on the ability of its rulers to outwit and outlast their rivals. For in Hattusa, the crown was forged as much in blood as in gold. Tudhaliya emerged from the turmoil with a vision to restore the strength of the empire through both military and administrative reform. Understanding that the chaos had weakened Hittite control, he moved quickly to consolidate power and re-establish loyalty among vassal states. One of his first acts was to reorganize the army. Chariot units were expanded, infantry retrained, and iron weapon production increased. He also improved supply chains, ensuring armies could campaign further and longer without losing effectiveness. In governance, Tudhaliya worked to strengthen the Panku Council, making it a more active participant in policymaking. This fostered trust among the nobility, reducing the chances of rebellion. He also invested in infrastructure, repairing roads, reinforcing city walls, and improving granaries to safeguard against famine. Tudhaliya's reign brought a renewed sense of stability. The borders were secured, the economy revived, and foreign relations improved. His reforms laid the foundation for the empire's resurgence, proving that the Hittites could recover from even the most turbulent times. Under his leadership, the Hittite Empire began to breathe again and prepare for the next great leap forward. To the west lay Arzawa, a wealthy kingdom controlling key trade routes to the Aegean. Tudhaliya saw both opportunity and threat, for Arzawa's growing influence could undermine Hittite power. The decision was made: the empire would march west. The campaign began with swift strikes against Arzawan border towns, forcing their armies into retreat. Hittite chariots and infantry advanced through rugged terrain, crossing rivers and scaling hills, under the watchful eyes of scouts. Supply lines were maintained through disciplined organization, and the army moved like a well-oiled machine. The final confrontation came outside the Arzawan capital. The battle raged from dawn to dusk, with arrows darkening the sky and chariots smashing into enemy lines. When the city gates finally fell, the Hittites imposed their authority, but rather than razing the city, Tudhaliya chose to install a loyal ruler, a vassal king bound by treaty. This victory extended Hittite influence to the western coast, opening new trade routes and securing valuable resources. It also sent a clear message to rivals: the Hittite Empire was once again a force to be reckoned with, non-erective. As the empire stabilized, the Hittites turned once more to honoring their gods. Grand temples rose in cities across Anatolia, with Hattusa boasting the most magnificent of them all. These structures were not just places of worship, they were centers of community life, economic activity, and royal ceremony. Built from massive stone blocks and decorated with relief carvings of deities, the temples were marvels of architecture. Courtyards bustled with priests, petitioners, and merchants selling offerings. Inside, the air was thick with incense as sacred hymns echoed off painted walls. The great temple of the storm god and the sun goddess stood as the heart of Hittite religion. Its sanctuaries held idols adorned with gold and precious stones, and its storehouses kept grain, oil, and wine for both ritual and charity. Festivals brought processions of worshippers, their colorful garments and rhythmic chants filling the streets. The building of these temples was a statement. The gods were with the Hittites, and their favor would keep the empire strong. In stone and faith, the Hittites anchored their civilization for generations to come, while the West brought trade and diplomacy. The East demanded constant vigilance. The lands beyond the Euphrates were home to powerful rivals and restless tribes. Under Tudalia's successors, the Hittites launched a series of eastern campaigns to secure their borders and extend influence into the rich lands of northern Syria. These campaigns were brutal and methodical. Hittite armies marched through narrow mountain passes, their columns stretching for miles, carrying provisions and siege equipment. River crossings were engineered with temporary bridges, and fortified outposts were established along the way to protect supply lines. Cities like Aleppo and Carchemish became key prizes, not only for their wealth but for their strategic position, controlling trade routes. Some fell by force, others surrendered under threat, swearing loyalty and sending tribute to Hattusa. The eastern campaigns were more than military ventures. They were exercises in integration. Captured cities were placed under loyal governors, often intermarried with Hittite nobility to cement alliances. Temples were built or restored in the name of both local gods and Hittite deities, blending traditions to win over the populace. Through this relentless push eastward, the Hittite Empire gained access to fertile lands, crucial trade, and a defensive buffer against its most dangerous foes. In the heart of Hattusa, beneath the watchful gaze of the palace guards, lay one of the most remarkable treasures of the ancient world, the royal archives. These rooms, lined with shelves and clay bins, held tens of thousands of tablets inscribed in cuneiform. Here, scribes recorded everything: treaties with foreign powers, royal decrees, tax records, religious hymns, and even correspondence between kings. The archives were the memory of the Hittite Empire, ensuring that no promise, law, or decision would be lost to time. Foreign envoys marveled at the precision of Hittite record-keeping. Every tablet was catalogued and stored according to subject, with some sealed and stamped with the royal seal for authenticity. Scribes worked in near silence, the scratch of reed styluses the only sound as they etched words into wet clay before baking them hard in kilns. The archives were also a hub of intelligence gathering. Reports from spies and scouts were stored alongside diplomatic messages, giving the king and his council a detailed picture of the empire's affairs. Centuries later, when the ruins of Hattusa were rediscovered, these tablets would tell the world the story of the Hittites, their triumphs, struggles, and the reach of their power. The Hittites called themselves the people of 1,000 gods, the Proetian, embracing not only their own deities, but also those of conquered lands. This religious inclusivity reached its peak during the grand annual festival held in Hattusa, a celebration that honored the pantheon and reinforced unity across the empire. Preparations began weeks in advance. Temples were adorned with garlands, streets swept clean, and markets filled with offerings. Delegations arrived from every province, bringing statues of their local gods to join the procession. The air filled with music, the smell of roasted meats, and the murmur of prayers in many tongues. The highlight was the sacred procession, priests and priestesses leading chariots that bore gilded statues of the storm god, the sun goddess, and countless other deities. The king and queen, in resplendent ceremonial attire, walked at the front, offering libations at key points along the route. The festival was both a religious act and a political one. By honoring every god, the Hittites acknowledged the cultures within their realm, binding them together under one divine umbrella. It was a vivid display of the empire's diversity and strength. A reminder that power lay not only in the sword, but in the shared faith of 1,000 gods. Loyalty was the lifeblood of the Hittite political system. Vassal kings, generals, and governors were bound to the throne through solemn oaths sworn before the gods. These oaths were not mere formalities. Breaking them invited divine wrath as well as royal punishment. The ceremony took place in the palace courtyard. Participants stood before altars laden with offerings, sacred weapons, and images of the gods. The high priest recited the terms of loyalty, obedience to the king, defense of the realm, and honesty in council. Each man repeated the words aloud, sealing them with the blood of a sacrificed animal. Symbolic acts followed, touching sacred weapons, drinking from a ceremonial cup, or placing hands upon the royal seal. Witnesses recorded the oath on clay tablets, storing them in the archives. These oaths created a powerful bond between the ruler and his subjects, reinforced by religion. To break faith was not just treason, it was sacrilege. The oath of loyalty kept the Hittite elite united through wars, famines, and political storms, ensuring that even in times of crisis, the empire's core remained steadfast. In the Hittite Empire, queens were far more than ornamental figures. They were power brokers, diplomats, and sometimes company rulers. Known as Tawanana, the queen held her own seal, issued decrees, and managed the empire's domestic affairs while the king was at war. One of the most influential queens was Puduhepa, wife of Hattusili III, a former priestess. She brought religious authority and sharp political insight to the throne. She corresponded directly with foreign rulers, negotiated treaties, and acted as a mediator in disputes among the nobility. In court, the queen presided over legal cases, particularly those involving temple lands or priestly disputes. Her role extended into religious life, overseeing major festivals and temple upkeep. Her apartments within the palace were hubs of both domestic management and diplomacy. Envoys seeking favor often brought gifts to the queen as well as the king, knowing her voice carried weight in council decisions. The Tawanana's power was such that her authority could outlast her husband's reign, creating political tension with new kings. Yet in times of crisis, a strong queen could hold the empire together through wisdom, negotiation, and the respect she commanded. For an empire to endure, it must be connected. The Hittites understood this well, constructing an extensive network of roads that linked their capital, Hattusa, to distant provinces and vassal states. These roads were not simple dirt tracks. They were engineered for efficiency, allowing armies, merchants, and messengers to travel swiftly across rugged terrain. The routes wound through mountain passes, skirted river valleys, and cut straight across plains. Stone paving was used in key sections to prevent erosion, and wooden bridges spanned fast-flowing rivers. Along these roads, way stations provided fresh horses, food, and shelter for official travelers. Road building was as much a military necessity as an economic one. Chariots and supply carts could move more efficiently, enabling rapid deployment of troops to trouble spots. Merchants benefited as well, carrying goods faster and more safely to distant markets. This network became the arteries of the Hittite Empire, ensuring that orders from the capital could reach the furthest borders within days instead of weeks. It was an unseen but vital element of Hittite power, a quiet infrastructure that allowed the empire's might to flow smoothly across its lands. To the north of Hattusa lay a land of dense forests and steep hills, home to fierce tribal peoples who resisted imperial rule. Known for their hit-and-run tactics, these tribes, particularly the Kaska, posed a constant threat to the Hittite heartland. Raiding parties would descend without warning, burning villages, stealing livestock, and vanishing back into the woods before the army could respond. These attacks were more than a nuisance. They disrupted supply lines and weakened border security. The Hittites responded with fortified outposts along the frontier, manned year-round by soldiers and scouts. Campaigns into the northern hills aimed to destroy the tribe's strongholds and secure their loyalty through force or diplomacy. The Kaska, however, were stubborn foes. They knew the terrain intimately, using it to evade capture. They were not easily assimilated, and their resistance became a recurring challenge for every Hittite king. The northern frontier was never entirely pacified, but the Hittites' persistence kept the tribes from threatening the capital itself. In this ongoing struggle, the empire's resilience was tested as much by the wild hills as by its human adversaries. In the heart of Hattusa, a quiet building bustled with the scratching of styluses and the murmur of lessons, the scribe's school. Here, young men from noble and skilled families learned the art of writing, a skill that opened doors to administration, diplomacy, and religious service. Training began with memorizing cuneiform signs, hundreds of them carved into clay tablets as practice. Students copied historical records, legal codes, and royal decrees under the watchful eyes of senior scribes. Lessons in mathematics, accounting, and foreign languages prepared them for the complexities of imperial administration. Graduates of the school could expect positions in the palace archives, temples, or as secretaries to generals and governors. Their work was essential. Every treaty, tax payment, and grain delivery depended on accurate record-keeping. In a world where most people could not write, scribes wielded quiet power. They were the keepers of knowledge, the transmitters of orders, and the chroniclers of the empire's history. Without them, the machinery of the Hittite state would grind to a halt. Among the regalia of the Hittite kings, one object stood above all others in symbolic power: the iron crown. Unlike crowns of gold or silver, this one was forged of the very metal that gave the Hittites their edge in war. Its weight reminded the wearer that kingship was not luxury, but responsibility and endurance. The crown was used only in the most solemn ceremonies: coronations, oath-takings, and declarations of war. Forged by the royal smiths, its design was simple yet commanding. But a band of iron set with a single polished onyx at the brow. Legend said the first iron crown was blessed by the storm god himself, granting divine authority to the kings of Hattusa. In times of crisis, the king might wear it into battle, a visible sign to his troops that the gods stood with them. Its symbolism endured for generations. The iron crown was more than a piece of regalia. It was the embodiment of Hittite resilience, forged from the empire's most guarded secret and worn by those charged with defending it behind the public face of diplomacy and war. The Hittite Empire maintained a network of spies and informants who carried the pulse of the realm back to the king. Disguised as merchants, envoys, or wandering craftsmen, these agents gathered intelligence on rival kingdoms and reported on unrest in the provinces. The spymaster, a trusted official within the palace, coordinated these operations. Messages were written in coded language, sometimes on wax tablets, with a second layer concealing the true text. Couriers risked capture and death to bring back critical information. Spies reported on troop movements, political intrigues, and economic shifts. Their work could determine whether the Hittites struck first in war or waited for an enemy to weaken. This shadow network was vital during fragile peace treaties, ensuring the Hittites were never caught unprepared. It was a dangerous profession. Agents who failed might vanish without a trace, swallowed by the lands they once infiltrated. Though their names rarely appeared in official records, these unseen figures played a decisive role in shaping the fate of the empire. The city of Kadesh, perched on the Orontes River in Syria, was a jewel worth fighting for. Controlling it meant holding a gateway between Egypt and the Hittite sphere of influence. For years, it had shifted hands between the two powers, and under the reign of Muwatalli II, the Hittites prepared to claim it decisively. The siege began with calculated precision. Hittite forces encircled the city, cutting off all trade and food supplies. Siege towers, battering rams, and earth ramps slowly inched toward the massive walls. Archers rained arrows to keep defenders pinned, while sappers undermined sections of the fortifications. The defenders resisted fiercely, using counterfire, oil traps, and sudden sallies to burn siege equipment. Yet the Hittite engineers adapted, replacing damaged machines and reinforcing weak points. After months of pressure, a breach opened in Kadesh's northern wall. Hittite infantry stormed through, followed by chariots to secure the streets. The city fell, and its ruler swore allegiance to Muwatalli II, cementing Hittite dominance in the region. At least for the moment, Kadesh would remain a contested prize for decades, but this siege was remembered as one of the Hittites' most disciplined and relentless military efforts. The Battle of Kadesh in Echenarbek Tishursus BCE, fought between the Hittites under Muwatalli II and the Egyptians under Ramesses II, ended not in total victory for either side, but in a stalemate. Years of skirmishes and mutual exhaustion followed, until diplomacy achieved what war could not: the Treaty of Eternal Peace. This treaty, recorded in both Hittite and Egyptian hieroglyphic versions, is the earliest known surviving peace treaty in history. It declared an end to hostilities, established borders, and pledged mutual defense against outside threats. The signing ceremony was a grand affair. Hittite envoys arrived in Egypt bearing gifts of gold, fine horses, and iron weapons. Egyptian scribes meticulously copied the treaty, which was then sealed with the royal seals of both kings. It was more than a political pact. It was a public demonstration of mutual respect between two ancient superpowers. For years afterward, the peace held, allowing both empires to turn their attention to internal stability and trade. The treaty stands as a remarkable example of ancient diplomacy, where the pen, or the stylus, truly rivaled the sword. The strength of the Hittite chariot corps depended on the quality of its horses, and nowhere was this better demonstrated than in the royal stables of Hattusa. This sprawling complex housed hundreds of the empire's finest steeds, bred and trained for speed, endurance, and discipline. Grooms began each day before sunrise, feeding the horses a carefully balanced diet of grain and forage. Trainers exercised them in the practice fields, teaching them to respond to voice commands and maintain formation under the chaos of battle. The stables were also a center for breeding, with meticulous records kept on bloodlines to ensure the best traits were passed on. Stallions and mares were selected for strength and temperament, producing generations of elite war horses. Horses were prized diplomatic gifts. To receive a pair from the Hittite king was a mark of the highest honor, often sealed by treaty or alliance. The royal stables were not just a place of care. They were a factory of war, producing the living engines that powered the empire's chariot dominance. In the late 4th century BCE, the unthinkable happened. Hattusa, the proud heart of the Hittite Empire, fell. The causes were many: internal strife, rebellion among vassals, invasions by the Kaska and other tribes, and the mysterious wave of destruction brought by the Sea Peoples across the Near East. The city's defenses, once impregnable, could not withstand the combined pressures. Food shortages crippled resistance, and the once thriving streets grew silent. Fires raged through the palace and temples, consuming archives and treasures that had stood for centuries. Survivors fled into the countryside, carrying with them fragments of the culture that had once ruled vast lands. The Iron Crown was lost, its fate unknown. The fall of Hattusa marked the end of the Hittite Empire, as a great power, but it was not the end of their legacy. In the ruins and scattered descendants, their laws, diplomacy, and ironworking would live on, influencing the civilizations that followed. The silence of Hattusa became one of history's great echoes, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can crumble. Though the empire fell, the Hittites' mastery of iron left an enduring mark on history. Long after their cities were abandoned, their technological secrets spread across the Near East, fueling the rise of new powers in the Iron Age. Weapons, tools, and agricultural implements made of iron transformed economies and societies. Armies could equip more soldiers with durable weapons, farmers could till soil more efficiently, and artisans could craft stronger goods. The Hittite contribution was not just the metal itself, but the understanding of how to produce it at scale. Their smelting techniques, carefully guarded for centuries, eventually became common knowledge, a gift and a curse for the world they left behind. In legend, the Hittites became remembered as the first true masters of the forge, the people who pulled the bones of the earth into shapes of power. Their name faded from memory for millennia, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists in the Shur-Joth century, when the ruins of Hattusa and its archives revealed the story anew. The Hittites' legacy is written not only in stone and clay, but in the very tools that built civilizations. When Hattusa burned and the empire collapsed, not all was lost. Groups of Hittite nobles, soldiers, and craftsmen fled to the southern regions of Anatolia and northern Syria, smaller sextates. These Neo-Hittite kingdoms were shadows of the once great empire, but they carried its traditions, Sitsaisa, language, and gods into a new age. In fortified hilltop towns like Carchemish and Melid, new rulers claimed descent from the kings of Hattusa. They maintained palaces adorned with familiar relief carvings of the storm god, preserved the legal codes, and continued the art of ironworking. Diplomacy and trade became lifelines, as these smaller states navigated a complex world dominated by rising powers like Assyria. The rebuilding was slow and fraught with danger. The Casca still prowled the northern hills, while Aramean tribes pressed in from the south. Yet these exiled Hittites proved resilient, forging alliances and defending their walls with the same determination their ancestors had shown. Though they would never regain the vast empire of old, their survival ensured that the Hittite name and culture would not vanish into history's shadows. In their cities, the clang of the forge and the voice of the storm god could still be heard. Even in exile, Hittite artisans left their mark in stone. Across Anatolia and northern Syria, monumental gateways, steels, and reliefs told stories of kings, gods, and great deeds. These carvings were more than decoration. They were propaganda, affirming the ruler's legitimacy and divine favor. Stone sculptors worked with painstaking care, chiseling intricate images into massive basalt blocks. Scenes depicted processions of deities, royal hunts, and battles. Inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphs preserved the names and deeds of rulers for future generations. Some reliefs adorned city gates, so that all who entered were reminded of the king's power. Others stood alone in sacred landscapes, marking boundaries or commemorating victories. The style was distinct, bold, stylized figures, deeply incised lines, and an emphasis on ceremonial poses. These sculptures were statements of survival. They declared that despite the loss of empire, the Hittite cultural identity endured. Carved into the very bedrock of the land, religion remained the unifying force for the Hittites, even after political fragmentation. In Neo-Hittite cities, the temples still rang with prayers to the storm god, the sun goddess, and countless local deities. Priests acted not only as spiritual leaders, but as political advisors, interpreting omens to guide rulers. Divination was a central practice. The priests examined the entrails of sacrificed animals, interpreted dreams, and observed the flight of birds to discern divine will. Festivals brought statues of gods from multiple cities into grand processions, reinforcing ties between allied states. The gods were seen as active participants in political life. Treaties were sworn before them, and their wrath was feared by anyone who broke an oath. In times of crisis, famine, plague, or war, rulers personally led sacrifices, hoping to restore divine favor. In this new age of uncertainty, the people clung even more tightly to their gods. They whispered prayers into the wind, believing the storm god's voice could still be heard in the roll of thunder over the hills. The hills, iron remained the Neo-Hittites' greatest asset. Though smaller in territory, their cities controlled valuable iron mines and workshops, making them indispensable to regional trade networks. Merchants carried Hittite iron weapons, tools, and ornaments to markets as far as Phoenicia, Assyria, and the Aegean. Trade routes were dangerous, crossing deserts, rivers, and mountain passes. Caravans traveled in groups, protected by armed escorts. At each stop, merchants exchanged goods, news, and sometimes intelligence for their rulers. The iron trade brought prosperity, but also jealousy from rival states. To protect their monopoly, Neo-Hittite kings strictly regulated mining and smelting, keeping the most advanced techniques within their own workshops. This iron road kept the smaller kingdoms relevant in an age of rising empires. Though their armies were modest compared to the giants of the Near East, their mastery of metal gave them a voice in the region's political chorus. As the Neo-Hittite kingdoms rebuilt, a new power loomed on the horizon. Assyria, fierce, disciplined, and expansionist, the Assyrians eyed the iron-rich lands of the Hittite successors with growing interest. At first, relations were cautious. Assyria engaged in trade, exchanging luxury goods for Hittite iron. But as Assyrian ambitions grew, diplomacy gave way to demands for tribute. Some Neo-Hittite kings complied, seeking to preserve autonomy through submission. Others resisted, fortifying their cities and forging alliances. Skirmishes broke out along the frontier, with Assyrian armies testing the defenses of cities like Carchemish. The Assyrian war machine, with its siege engines and relentless infantry, posed a challenge unlike any the Hittites had faced before. The shadow of Assyria was a constant reminder that the age of small kingdoms was drawing to a close. Yet in their defiance and negotiations, the Neo-Hittites showed the same stubborn resilience that had once made their ancestors masters of iron. In the face of growing Assyrian aggression, the Neo-Hittite states sought unity. Kings who had once competed for influence gathered in secret councils, agreeing to set aside rivalries for survival. The alliance included Carchemish, Melid, and several smaller city-states, as well as Aramean allies who also feared Assyrian domination. Envoys traveled tirelessly, carrying messages of cooperation. Military plans were drawn, detailing how forces would combine in the event of an invasion. Each kingdom pledged troops, provisions, and, most importantly, iron weapons. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the heirs of Hattusa might forge a new era of strength. And the sight of combined armies marching together rekindled memories of the old Hittite Empire's power. But alliances are fragile. Personal ambitions, old grudges, and differing priorities eroded the unity. When the Assyrian threat materialized, some states held back their promised support, hoping to survive by appeasing the conqueror. The last alliance was a noble effort, but without absolute trust, it could not stand Against the relentless tide of Assyrian expansion, Carchemish, the jewel of the Neo-Hittite world, stood as the last great bulwark against Assyrian domination. Perched on the Euphrates River, its massive walls and strategic location made it both a fortress and a prize. The Assyrians came in force, their siege engines rumbling across the plains. Towers rolled forward, battering rams hammered the gates, and relentless archery harassed the defenders on the walls. Inside the city, soldiers fought tirelessly to repel assaults, while citizens carried water, repaired breaches, and maintained morale. The siege lasted months. Carchemish's defenders hoped for relief from allied states, but aid never arrived in force. Starvation and exhaustion took their toll. At last, the Assyrian army broke through, flooding into the streets. The city was plundered, its leaders executed or carried away into exile. The fall of Carchemish was the death knell of Neo-Hittite independence. The last echo of Hattusa's power faded into history, swallowed by the Assyrian Empire's relentless advance. With Carchemish fallen, the Hittite people were scattered. Some were deported to distant Assyrian provinces, where they became part of the imperial labor force. Others fled into the mountains or merged with neighboring cultures. In foreign lands, they carried fragments of their heritage, worship of the storm god, knowledge of ironworking, and elements of their language. Some rose to prominence as skilled craftsmen or military officers in their new homes. Though politically erased, the Hittites lived on in the tapestry of the Near East. Their gods found places in the pantheons of other cultures. Their legal traditions influenced foreign courts, and their metallurgical skills transferred. The end of their kingdoms was not the end of their people. Instead, their identity became woven into the fabric of other civilizations, an invisible but enduring legacy. For nearly 3,000 years, the Hittites were forgotten. Their name vanished from history, their cities buried under earth and time. It wasn't until the late Shurjoth century that archaeologists, inspired by biblical references, began uncovering clues to their existence. In Ichen Babait Sansasus, French explorer Charles Texier stumbled upon the ruins of Hattusa. Later excavations revealed massive city walls, temples, and thousands of clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform. Scholars deciphered the Hittite language, realizing it was the oldest known Indo-European tongue. The rediscovery transformed our understanding of the ancient Near East. The Hittites emerged not as a minor biblical footnote, but as a major empire, rival to Egypt and Assyria. Their treaties, laws, and metallurgy reshaped the story of civilization. Today, the ruins of Hattusa are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, standing as silent witnesses to a people whose legacy was almost lost and then brought back to life by the persistence of modern discovery. From their humble beginnings in the hills of Anatolia to the grand empire that rivaled Egypt's. The Hittites' story is one of resilience, innovation, and legacy. At the heart of it all was iron, the metal they mastered before anyone else, the tool that shaped their rise and ensured their place in history. The Eternal Forge is not a literal place, but a symbol of the enduring influence of their achievements. Their knowledge spread far beyond their borders, fueling the Iron Age and altering the balance of power in the ancient world. Even in their fall, they left behind more than ruins. They left the world stronger tools, more advanced diplomacy, and a deeper understanding of governance. Their rediscovery reminds us that history is full of forgotten giants, waiting to be unearthed. As long as iron rings on anvils and treaties are sworn in the name of peace, the spirit of the Hittites lives on in the eternal forge of human progress. And so our journey through the rise, glory, and fall of the Hittites comes to a close. From their mountain strongholds in Anatolia to the grand halls of Hattusa, from the thunder of chariot wheels to the quiet work of scribes and smiths, the Hittites left a mark that time could not erase. They were masters of iron, visionaries in diplomacy, and architects of a legal and cultural system that influenced civilizations for centuries. Even in defeat, they endured, their knowledge, gods, and traditions carried forward by scattered descendants and absorbed into the cultures around them. For thousands of years they were forgotten, their greatness buried under dust and stone. But history has a way of speaking again, and when the ruins of Hattusa emerged from the earth, so too did the story of a people who shaped the ancient world. As you reflect on their journey, remember the tools we forge today, in metal, in words, in ideas, may become the legacy of tomorrow. The Hittites remind us that while empires may fall, the sparks they cast can light fires for generations to come. Thank you for walking this road of history with us.